A few months ago, I kitbashed a Necrofex Colossus from the Total War Warhammer games, and since then I've been eager to do more nautical themed undead builds. Fortunately, the Vampire Coast faction from that game has some excellent options, including a fearsome reanimated hermit crab that inhabits the smashed remnants of a ship, which is exactly what I'll be building in this guide. I'm Pete the Wargamer, and today I'll be showing you how to kitbash a Rotting Leviathan. I'll be giving this guide the full 5 dead animal bits out of 5. It's going to be a big model that requires parts from a few different kits, and I'll also be doing some extensive modifications and sculpting. My first task was choosing a kit to base this around. Games Workshop has a severe lack of suitable sea creatures. Sure, the Eiseneth Deepkin have some great options, but none of these really fit the crustacean theme. The next best thing was the Ragnarok kit from the Gloomspite Gits. This enormous spider pretty much had everything that I required: bulk, lots of legs, and a chitinous carapace, all of which I could put to good use in my giant crab. So to begin, I focused just on the main body. I glued my body together and made sure to smooth out that central seam. Following this, I immediately flipped the torso upside down. The original Ragnarok has its thorax low to the ground with its abdomen rising up behind it. I wanted this to be reversed so that the points where the legs were attached were more elevated. But before I attached the larger armor plate to the abdomen, I first needed to make an adjustment, namely to the large spike in the center of the panel. This was clipped away and shaved flat. This would be the point where the body would rest against the ground, so removing this protrusion would create a more suitable footing for later. Then, following the standard instructions, I then proceeded to attach the mandibles and other components around the mouth to complete, for the lack of a better word, the face of the crustacean. At this point, I could begin making my first few serious modifications. The problem with basing my conversion around the Ragnarok is that I needed to make sure that the finished model didn't just look like a reposed spider. This would be resolved partly by flipping the model upside down, but also by adjusting the silhouette of the miniature by moving around the armor plates. Starting with the armor panel that would normally sit against the front part of the abdomen, I separated it out into 3 separate parts. I created 2 diagonal cuts, both starting where the circular groove began to form. With the cuts made, I focused on the central piece first. I trimmed down the cut edges to round them out and better blend them into the other edges of the plate. Once everything had been smoothed out, the plate was glued above the head, positioning the wider end of the plate slightly overhanging the mouth. This made a big difference in how the Leviathan looked, but there were still further changes to be made here. Following this, I then attached a few of the regular armor plates to their normal locations on the underside of the Leviathan's thorax. With these in place, I then grabbed the 2 sections that I'd sawn away earlier. I intended to attach these, joining the cut edges together. But to get these to form a strong bond, I cleaned up and filed the edges flat. Once done, the 2 armor plates were glued together and this new plate was glued beneath the thorax. Next, I took the small mandibles that would normally be attached around the mouth. I decided to use these as small forelimbs instead, but due to their rounded ends, I first needed to flatten them out. These were then glued beneath the mouth, positioned just within the small recesses of that new armor plate. At this point in the build, I had a lot of flat, featureless areas. This would normally have been covered with plates of armor, but after moving them around, these parts were left bare. To bring a little back into these parts of the model, I began by cutting up and mixing some green stuff. A few lumps of putty were added to the blank space just above the forearms. These were first smoothed out and blended together to cover the whole area. Following this, I then added a series of grooves and folds. I wanted this area to look soft and fleshy, something that would contrast against the strong-edged armor around it. All the while I was doing this, I made sure to use plenty of Vaseline on my fingers and tools. This just helps prevent the putty from sticking, and it also creates a smoother surface finish as well. Further green stuff was then added just beneath the plate that sat above the head. I spread this out like before and then added some finer lines emanating from beneath the armor towards the edge. This created a blend between the two and helped to sell them as being part of this organic creature. A lot more green stuff was then added to the lower part of the abdomen. I rolled out 2 sausages and laid them parallel across the flat section. Like with the piece above the mandibles, I spread the putty out so that it covered the entire area, and again scoured in a series of grooves and folds. As the name Rotting Leviathan suggested, I wanted this flesh to look rotten and putrefying. This was achieved rather simply by very lightly pressing the pointed end of a sculpting tool into a few of these folds. This resulted in the appearance of decaying flesh beginning to fall apart, and completed the sculpting across the main torso for the time being. Now that the torso was pretty much completed, I could begin to focus on the limbs. These were sourced from the Ragnarok kit, but as I had vastly adjusted the orientation of the model, the limbs wouldn't work in the way they were intended to. I began with a pair of legs that came in a single piece and compared this against the second most forward sockets to check how that position I wanted them to be in would actually work. After playing around with the position a little, I then brought in a pair of separate upper leg pieces. These would serve nicely as part of the clawed limbs. I checked the position of these alongside the legs in the frontmost slots. However, the small tabs at the ends of these were getting in the way, so they first needed to be clipped away and then smoothed out. With a little adjustment, these legs were now fitting much better. With the arms selected, I could focus on building the claws. These will be created using two of the largest lower leg sections from the Ragnarok kit, as well as these smaller single-piece legs. I would combine these to create a claw, but as I only needed the bottom section of the smaller leg, I would need to start cutting. I first removed the end section of the leg, along with the small skulls from the bottom. These cuts were then smoothed out and cleaned up. With this done, I was left with the two main parts that would make up each claw. However, they didn't quite look like claws just yet. Crab claws often have a jagged ridge along the inner edge of the claw, and this would be recreated by first drilling a series of 1mm holes. I didn't worry about getting everything perfectly straight here, as a little variation would just simply add to the effect. Into these holes, I then glued some 1mm plastic rod before clipping them down, making sure that each was a slightly different length. This was then repeated across the other three claws until I was left with the following. The next task was attaching these to each other, but as there weren't any nice flat surfaces to get a good bond to, I chose to pin the two halves of the claw together. This was approached in much the same way as the last step, with me drilling two smaller holes into the two halves that I wanted to join, taking care that the holes would line up with each other once they're brought together. With the holes drilled, you can then take a piece of plastic rod or metal wire that is the same diameter as the hole you've just drilled, 1mm in this case. One end of this rod is then glued into one of the holes, and any excess rod is clipped away until just a few millimeters are left. This protruding section of rod was then glued into the hole on the other half of the claw, with further glue being added to the claws as well. This pinning helped to strengthen the bond and is a great way of attaching parts together that were never intended to be joined. This was repeated on the other claw, and I was left with the following. I had a great starting point, but the rods looked bare and it looked more like it was fused together rather than having some way for the pincers to move against each other. I again fixed these problems with green stuff. For the teeth, I cut, mixed and rolled out some sausages and pressed them against the protruding rods. These were smoothed and blended out so they were rounded at the top and transitioned down into the claw. To create the appearance of a joint in the claw, I decided to blend the chitin of the lower claw around the upper one. This was achieved by applying a few small lumps of green stuff around the joint. I then blended these together, smoothing the green stuff out into the larger claw and creating a defined edge against the other. This helped to transform the two spider legs into some crab claws, but as I'd used green stuff here, I needed to leave them to firm up. While I was waiting for the green stuff to cure, I returned to make the body. Getting the legs into the right position would be much easier if the miniature was already attached to the base. I made a start on this earlier by removing that spike, but I still needed to do a little bit of extra trimming and filing to flatten out that bottom section. This was followed up with a bit more pinning to secure the bond. Finally, to help shore things up a bit, I added some leftover green stuff around the bottom and smoothed this into the base. Because the torso was fixed to the base now, it was much easier to attach the legs in a position that not only helps to support the model, but also looks realistic. I grabbed the large single piece legs that I tested earlier and noticed that the upper parts of these legs had a small depression with a tab in the center of it. These will be quite visible and so need to be first cut away. In addition to this, I also used some pinning to help improve the bond between these legs and the torso. I drilled all the necessary holes and added the plastic rod, but didn't attach the legs just yet. First, I smoothed out the recesses in the legs that I'd removed the tabs from by using a little more green stuff, blending them out to fit the contours of the leg. I gave these a few hours to firm up before gluing them into place. The remaining pair of legs were then assembled and glued into the third set of holes before finishing off by attaching the larger set of mandibles into the rear slots on the thorax. These would take the place of vestigial legs that would sit inside the shell that I would be attaching later on. With the legs in place and the green stuff on the claws cured, I could begin to attach them. I grabbed the upper leg sections that I'd modified previously and clipped away the rounded tab from one end. I then shaved this back so that just the carapace remained. Similarly, the rounded joints on the claws were trimmed back just a little bit so they created a flat plateau that lined up nicely against the arm. Each claw was then pinned and attached to its arm before these arms were attached to the torso, which completed the body, at least for the most part. There were still a few details to fill in with more putty. The first of these were the points where the legs had attached to the thorax. As the bonds weren't perfect, there were gaps, and so I used some green stuff to create some hoods over these joints. Over the abdomen, there were a series of holes which featured spiders crawling out of them. I could have probably left these alone as these areas would have been covered over, but to be on the safe side, I opted to fill them up with some small lumps of green stuff. I left these details to cure overnight before building the shell. The Rotting Leviathan is basically a giant hermit crab that uses the sunken hulks of ships to protect itself, rather than the shells that litter the ocean floor. The most obvious choice for one of these was the Gloom-Tide shipwreck kit. I'd already used this extensively in my Necrofax Colossus build, so I handily had a few parts left over. If I followed the kit's instructions, the hull would be much too big, so I instead chose to chop up the various panels that I had remaining. I used a combination of my clippers and saw to do this before trimming those cuts clean. After I gathered a few of these sections of smashed wood, I began to glue them to the abdomen of the Leviathan, following the rounded surface the best I could. I didn't have quite enough planks to fill out the shipwreck though. To resolve this, I grabbed a piece of flooring from the Azurite Shattered Plaza set and began to cut, trim and glue these to the models as well. You could of course use actual balsa wood for these. It would make the build much cheaper and probably easier. But personally, I find that using wood for things like this can create a bit too much difference in appearance to the texture of the plastic around it. By using plastic parts, it helps to make the finished result look more like an actual kit that you could buy. Once I had constructed the shipwreck shell, there were just a few extra details left to add to it. The first of these would come from the Ogre Moor Tribe's Gluttons kit. From its command sprue, I grabbed the banner and parts that go into building the little crow's nest. After a little trimming to help them both fit better, I then attached the crow's nest and banner to the shipwreck, with the latter of these two looking like a section of torn sail. To occupy the crow's nest, I grabbed one of the Soulblight zombies and chose a suitable head and torso combination that would make it look like a reanimated sailor. I had to make a slight modification to the nest to allow the miniature fit, but once this was done, the zombie was attached. The original 3D model of the Leviathan sports a large number of barnacles and rope attached around its limbs. To create this rope, I could have turned to green stuff, but I instead opted for a much easier solution, and one that involved power tools. I grabbed myself a length of copper wire, 28 gauge to be precise, and unraveled a length that was about 2 to 3 times longer than I wanted the end result to be. I bent this in half to create a loop at the midpoint. This loop was then attached to a drill, and I made sure to tighten up the chuck enough so that the wire was held firmly. With a pair of pliers, I held onto the other ends of the wire before beginning to slowly turn it. As one end turned and the other stayed still, the wire began to twist itself into a braid-like pattern with remarkably little effort. The great thing about this was that because I'd used a pliable copper wire, the finished result was easy to bend and shape. I took advantage of this by wrapping sections of this cord around the legs, claws and shell of my Leviathan, using superglue to fix it into place. To tackle the barnacles, I used this rivet mold from Green Stuff World, which you may recognise from my Iron Hands conversion guide. It features these squat hexagonal pyramid shapes in various sizes, which are perfect for representing barnacles. To create these, I grabbed some oven drying polymer clay, super sculpy to be precise, and pressed the clay into the mold, using my roller to ensure that the recesses were completely filled. I then carefully cut away the excess clay until I was left with the following. This was then placed into the oven and baked for 15 minutes at 270 degrees F or 130 degrees C to harden them up. Once baked, I popped out the rivets and I was left with a number of these small hexagonal pyramids. These were then superglued into small clusters of varying sizes around various parts of the model. These were great for further separating the finished model from the original Ragnarok kit. And here we have the fully built Rotting Leviathan, but the base would need tackling before I could paint. Now before I go on, I just want to say a big thank you to Luke Mockridge for giving me the tip on creating these barnacles. I highly recommend you go check out some of his excellent work over on Instagram, and I'll include a link to his account below. To create the appearance of a beach or the seabed near the shore, I wanted to add a series of tidal ridges into my sand. These would be formed by using some milliput. I generally prefer milliput for bases rather than green stuff. Once you've added water, you can get some really nice flowing contours, and its extra weightiness creates a nice solid base. I rolled out a series of sausages of varying lengths and thicknesses and added these to the base, positioning them parallel to each other. I blended one side of each of these rolls into the base to create a small ridge. This was repeated across the entire base. While the milliput was still soft and workable, I added a few extra details. The first of these was from the top half of the now old Games Workshop skeletons. I clipped this away from the sprue and pressed this into one of the ridges. This was followed up by a few extra skulls, as well as some spare lengths of wood and a chest from a Free Guild artillery piece. These were all scattered about the base, each being pressed into the putty to just add a little extra detail. Finally, texture was added in the form of a very fine sand that is normally used for bird cages. I applied some watered down PVA across the base and ridges and then sprinkled the sand over the top, tapping away any excess and leaving it all to dry. With this done, I just needed to apply some paint, which left me with this. And here we have the completed Rotting Leviathan, painted up to match my Necrofex Colossus. Once again, it has been an incredibly fun challenge to tackle a large kit bash. These kinds of builds are always a little scarier because you're creating something brand new, but the results are worth it. There are probably a few things I could have done better, like adding in a few antennae and eye stalks, or even giving the ship parts more of a defined hull shape. But I can always keep these in mind if I wanted to build some more rotting Prometheans. In terms of gaming, the model is a little tricky to use due to its base size. Few models sit on a 160mm base, and even none of those are available to the undead. But with some homebrewed rules or some allowances, I could probably use it as an alternative to something like a zombie dragon or a coven throne. But if you have any rule suggestions of your own, let me know in the comments below. Now, if you enjoyed this video and would like to see me tackle more Vampire Coast units, or even just more bigger builds, then make sure to leave me a like, along with your suggestions for exactly what you'd like to see me tackle. So finally, let me just say a huge thank you to my ever generous supporters. Currently, my top supporters on Patreon are Gesteigpanzer, Jonathan Hart, Stuart Smith, Berserker, Daniel Dowling, Jake, Jeremy Kaup, Jesse Smith, Casper Strand, Lyconian Primarch, Merrick, Mr. Grimm, Raphael Beiruthi, Nice OJ, and Swedsman. So a big thank you to you guys, and if you also support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or you just use my affiliates links, then it's the kind-hearted people such as yourselves that allow me to fund the equipment and kits required to build these bigger kit bashes such as this one here. And so until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.